Well, when I was a young Justice Department lawyer back in the Lincoln administration, I had the privilege of being a special prosecutor assigned to ferret out and prosecute fugitive Nazi war criminals who had come unlawfully into the United States. And as a result, I became a sort of go-to person on human rights issues in the Department of Justice and in the federal government. And so I ended up having the privilege of becoming the primary draftsperson of the Refugee Act of 1980, which remains the modern American law of asylum. From my prosecutor's position, I moved on to becoming a United States immigration judge in Los Angeles, and thus began to interpret and apply the very asylum law that I helped draft. And when I drafted the law, we lived in a bipolar world. There was the West on the one hand and the Soviet bloc on the other, and most of the asylum applicants who sought refugee protection in the U.S. Were those who had fled the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact states. Well, we now live in a multipolar world, and we also live in a world of asymmetrical force. So there are all sorts of governments and even non-governmental entities that contribute to the persecution, torture, and enslavement of people, their own people and people who find themselves under the jurisdiction of terrorists or terrorist states or authoritarian regimes. And so as a judge, I began to see the emergence of issues that did not exist at the time the asylum law had been written, which meant that the asylum law became even more important because it began to be used not just as a device to protect political refugees, but to protect a whole panoply of groups and individuals for other reasons. The asylum statute provides for the protection and the granting of legal refugee status in this country of those who are able to demonstrate a well-founded fear of future persecution or who can demonstrate past persecution from a government or non-governmental entity for reasons of either race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. In the 1980s, the major issues in asylum cases were politics and religion. However, since then, we've also had a proliferation in the cases of those who sought protection from national origin or ethnic persecution. Armenians from Azerbaijan, Shiite Muslims from Sunni Muslim states, and vice versa. Jews from various countries where they still live, evangelical Christians from China, and of course victims or possible victims of terrorism in countries that are unable to restrain the terrorists. And the result is that we now have a wider variety of people who need refugee protection. And also the world is really not economically kinder to refugees. So you have a situation where you have a more diverse number of people seeking asylum protection without necessarily having the resources to find the best legal representatives they can. And the existence of a legal representative, of a competent legal representative to advocate for an asylum seeker's case can more often than not make the difference between a successful case and an unsuccessful case. I saw this as a judge. And when I left the judiciary, I became the founding director of the Asylum and Refugee Law Clinic at Pepperdine University Law School, where I trained and supervised law students as they represented and counseled asylum seekers who did not have the financial means to find private counsel. Unfortunately, there is no right to counsel in immigration cases. They're not criminal cases, even though the consequences to someone of being deported may well be as onerous as the consequences to someone of being in prison. We had this asylum clinic in which we represented individuals whom we found credible and who required asylum protection for a number of reasons. As I said, not just politics and religion, but also race and ethnicity. And the most emerging group, the one that has become, in a way, the most hotly debated category, is social group. What does it mean to be a member of a particular social group? When I first started as an immigration judge in the early 1990s, I was only one of a handful of judges in LA and in the country to find that LGBT individuals were members of a particular social group with innate common characteristics. Most judges at the time felt that homosexuality, bisexuality, transgender status were lifestyle choices, which we now know to be scientifically wrong, but at the time was a very popularly held, if erroneous, view. When I was first a judge, I was one of the few on the bench who granted asylum to individuals who were persecuted in foreign countries because they were disabled or because they were abused women whom the state would not protect from their abusive partners or families. And also victims of honors killings in the Middle East. It thus was clear that the social group category began to become, as one person put it, an open door that just kept opening. Because as the world changed, we recognized that more and more social groups were being mistreated and needed asylum protection. The asylum clinic provided help in that regard, and indeed, over the course of several years, we never lost a case because we trained our law students well, we supervised them well, and the judges in Los Angeles and Southern California saw that once the clinic had vetted individuals, there wasn't really as much to do in court. And so we won all of those cases. It also was clear to me and others that even given the success of the asylum clinic, there was something missing. When someone has suffered persecution or torture, and thus also suffered traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder or chronic depression, granting them asylum or helping them get asylum is only the beginning of the process. When such an individual receives asylum, his or her life is saved. But the question then arises, well, then what? It occurred to me and to others who worked with me that shaking the hands of our clients when they won their asylum cases and wishing them well wasn't really enough. We wanted to help them integrate into American society. We wanted to help them not just have expert witnesses like therapists who helped them in cases, but also who helped them in therapy after the cases were over. We also wanted to get them social services assistance so that they could develop meaningful family relationships, which is very difficult in the case of individuals who have been abused in a family situation in societies that wouldn't protect them, because their understanding of the government and of society as a weapon rather than an assistance was clear, and we had to help them make the transition. And lastly, we wanted to help them learn English. We wanted to help them learn how to put on a suit of clothes, Western style, interview for jobs, Western style. All of this required more than just first-rate legal assistance. And therefore, together with some other wonderful and competent people who had assisted me in the clinic, we helped set up an organization called the Coalition for the Advocacy of the Persecuted and Enslaved, CAPE, an organization devoted to assisting indigent asylum seekers, victims of torture, and victims of human trafficking, modern slavery, not just in obtaining legal assistance to regularize their immigration status, but to obtain medical, therapeutic, and social service assistance to integrate themselves into American life. And it is the aim and business of CAPE to provide what I like to call the one-stop shopping aid. And I don't mean by that some sort of McDonald's where you come up to the window and ask for a burger. What I mean by that is that you minimize the number of hoops through which these victims, and often traumatized victims of persecution, must jump to get all the assistance they need. Also, study after study have shown that if you develop a bond of trust between the clients on the one hand and the legal representatives on the other, it's much easier to maintain that bond of trust in the same setting and then provide the therapeutic and social service assistance needed, rather than wish these people luck and have them start all over again with strangers. There is a cultural disconnect between people from very different societies and Western lawyers, Western adjudicators, and Western healthcare professionals. It's the job of CAPE to mediate and bridge those cultural disconnects, and in doing so provide a full panoply of assistance. Now, to do that, of course, requires first-rate personnel, which in return requires money. Unfortunately, things don't just get done. They don't just happen. We need money to provide the kind of services beyond the volunteers that we have, so that we can help as many people as possible. We already have a waiting list. We're already referred people by other organizations. And now that human trafficking has become, unfortunately, such a big issue in asylum law, and the need for legal and therapeutic services that arise in the case of people who have been enslaved, we need as much in the way of resources, i.e. money, as possible to provide the services that are needed, which are a spectrum of services. We live in a very complex world where there is actually more persecution and torture, and where human trafficking has become one of the most serious forms of abuse of people, particularly but not exclusively women and children, that has ever been imagined, let alone occurred in the world. Of the three largest criminal enterprises on earth, the first is drugs, the second is armaments, and the third is people. And in fact, we ought to call human trafficking by its real name, slavery. As I say when we fundraise to my audiences, now that you know what it is, you can help or you cannot help, but you can never say you didn't know. And I wanted to add that because of my work in prosecuting Nazi war criminals, I had the opportunity, I won't say the thrill, but the opportunity of visiting places like the site of the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp, the Dachau concentration camp, the site of many ghettos. And I found that places like Auschwitz were not just in and of themselves kingdoms of horror, but they were metaphors for the evil, the worst form of evil in the modern world. And what I'm seeing now more and more, on a smaller scale, but not so much smaller, is the refrain that Auschwitz remains relevant. And that's a horrible thing. The notion that we've not learned so much that we are preventing persecution from happening again on a global scale that we've not learned so much that we're still turning people away, and we are, is a frightening notion. What we're trying to do with CAPE is provide a strong, good right arm to needy people who have credible stories of persecution, of torture, and of human trafficking, to whom the processes of law in the United States are matters of life and death. And more often than not, these people will not be able to obtain life without help. So everything we can do for these people is critical to them. And once we help them obtain legal status, we can then move on and help them integrate in a healthy and meaningful way into the community of Americans. They have legal status and they continue to suffer the nightmares, the cold sweats, the depression, the suicidal thoughts, and the inability to learn English, to dress for interviews, and hold jobs because of their medical and psychological problems. So what we want to do is not just meet them at the beginning, but take them through to the end. Not only is that a source of great satisfaction, but it's a necessity if we want these people to be made whole. It's also much safer for us as a country to provide that level of assistance, because when people fall through the cracks, they become desperate. And when they become desperate, they will do most anything to survive. If we provide them legal assistance all along the way, they won't feel desperate. They'll get the treatment they need. They'll have legal status. And the result is that they'll become a much more higher level functioning community. Whereas if we just say, congratulations, you're here legally, don't call us, we'll call you, that we're really just saying to them, well, your lives are saved, but you're really going to exist, you're not going to live. We want to help them live. And helping asylum seekers is not the same as helping criminals who come from abroad. We've heard a lot about how this country is being plagued by an epidemic of foreign-born criminals. I don't think that's true, but even if it were, the people that CAPE is seeking to represent and assist are the victims of criminality. They are not criminals. They are the victims of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, of attempts at genocide, of persecution, and of torture. All prohibited activities. They are victims. We're representing decent people who could have been the rest of us, but for the grace of God and the accident of birth. Any one of us could have been born as Christians in China trying to worship freely, only to incur police abuse. Any one of us could have been born Jews in radically Islamist societies, or moderate Muslims in radically Islamist society. Any one of us could have been born into domestically abusive families in which the religious hierarchy and the government actually encouraged the abuse because of a perverse notion of how people must obey the heads of the family, even if it means suffering a form of torture and ultimately execution. So I try to remind myself that we are helping people whom, but for an accident of birth, could have been yours truly, and I could have been the people at the other end of the table needing the assistance. One of the most successful immigrant communities in the history of the United States is the Iranian American community, both Jewish and non-Jewish. The overwhelming majority of Iranian Americans either descend from or are people who fled persecution under the theocratic regime that now runs that country. But for the terrible persecution of these people and or their families in Iran, we would not have as many high-functioning, successful, and very consistently tax-paying physicians, dentists, business people, lawyers, and teachers. And so, like in so many cases in our history, we have received from some of the most gifted individuals from other countries who have been persecuted in part because they were so exceptional and weren't supposed to be exceptional because they were considered to be despicable minorities or women who didn't know their place. In this country, they flourish, and that's an economic benefit to us. But let me say on the flip side of the coin that the desire for economic improvement is not a basis for legitimately seeking asylum. So again, we're dealing with a narrow but well-defined group of people who are fleeing to save their lives and their liberty. We're not defending criminals. We're not defending so-called economic refugees, which means that we get the benefit of high-functioning individuals who, once they get the legal and therapeutic assistance they need, tend to be very successful taxpayers in the United States without in any way taking so-called economic refugees who become a burden on the system. Despite what some people think, the situation is in fact inverted. We are not assuming as much a burden as we are an advantage. Right. Our focus at CAPE is on people who are literally facing life or death situations, who have done nothing wrong, and who are seeking the protection of a country that, it's corny to say but very true, was built on a model of protecting victims of persecution. And so in helping the kind of people that we at CAPE assist, we are continuing a long-held tradition in American life of paying respect and providing protection for people who are coming here and want to stay here for the very same reasons that our founders created the American Republic. That is to say, they all wanted to live in a democracy under the rule of law, where people would be judged and even hated for what they did, and not for their last names or their religion or their politics or their ethnicity. We in this country believe that individuals should be judged by the contents of their character and not the color of their skin, to quote Martin Luther King Jr., and should be judged by their conduct, how they treat each other, not because they are a different religion than the majority, not because their politics are different than the majority, not because their sexual orientation is different than the majority. We are all part of one minority or another. At some point in life, we all fall in a minority posture, whether it's for political reasons or religious reasons or social reasons. In another country, we would all be possible refugees fleeing life or death situations. In this country, we at CAPE are simply asking the rest of us to seriously consider the plight of people who have the same values we do and face the same threats that our antecedents did, and whom the founders created this republic as a means of protecting. To do all that, however, requires money and resources. But you know, what we at CAPE are trying to do is consistent not just with our political tradition, but with our faith-based traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, God commands, both in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, that we welcome the strangers as we would welcome ourselves, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. In the Christian Bible, the New Testament, God urges that people welcome the stranger, for in doing so and without knowing we might be entertaining angels in our midst. Well, it's part of the better angels of our nature to protect those who have done nothing wrong except hold certain religious or political beliefs or sexual orientation or have a certain ethnic origin. We are attempting to defend the defenseless and to heal broken bones and broken souls. That's what we at CAPE are trying to do with our one-shop mentality and point of view. And the more resources we can obtain, the more we can do that. And if we get the resources we need at CAPE, a generation from now, the future senators and governors and doctors and lawyers and human rights advocates will be the sons and daughters of the people we helped, as well as good and decent native-born citizens of the United States. In a sense, we at CAPE are not just here to protect refugees, but to honor our own values, to reaffirm who we are at our best, not just to protect the lives and sacred honor of those who need asylum protection, but to protect the lives and sacred honor of those of us who love our country and stand by its values. We are a very traditional values organization. We go back to the principles of the founding, and we go back to the principles of the 14th American, that every individual, every person, not just every citizen, should be treated equally with dignity and respect. And there's nothing radical about that. There's nothing radical about CAPE. We're just trying to advance those values that have made America great and to protect people who really do look at us as a shining city on the hill. Their worst day in America is the best day in their lives. They remind us what we represent to much of the rest of the world. And so if we want to reaffirm our own values, we can do so by protecting those who seek to become part of a society that protects those values. And so in honoring the refugee, we honor ourselves and we make ourselves stronger, because the people the rest of the world expels as refuse are the people we welcome who become the bulwark of our next generation. And that is something at CAPE that we understand and of which we are very mindful. And I hope that people who believe in the basic principles of American democracy will give what they can to allow us to do what we can to help decent people. There are many organizations that help people. They help educate people. They save people from poverty. We save people's lives, literally. And then when we are able to save their lives, we enhance the quality of those lives and lead them to becoming fully functioning, patriotic citizens of the United States. No one's more patriotic than someone whose life has been saved by the United States. And so I think CAPE does us as much good as it does the refugee. And I'm hoping that enough people agree and will give whatever they can in the way of money and support, will volunteer their resources and their time to the most American of efforts, which is to give dignity to each individual life. Our ultimate aim at CAPE is not just to provide one-stop shopping, as I've explained here in the States, but to provide people based at UN refugee camps and in foreign places who can help screen these individuals and try to convince the State Department that those who are credible should be able to get refugee status before they even come here. which will lower the court dockets and make it easier to save more lives, more economically, without putting an extra burden on the American justice system. What I'd like to do is to have CAPE become a global aid, not just for refugees, but for those in the UN, in the US State Department, in foreign governments, and with Homeland Security based overseas, who have to consider these cases, to provide a level of expertise and compassion, practical work with idealistic intentions that can nip these situations in the bud overseas. My ultimate goal is to put CAPE out of business, because one day hopefully we won't need it. But in the meantime, I'd like us to become a global conglomerate for good. I'd like us to help create a kingdom of conscience in the human rights community and in the legal world, not just here, but throughout the world. And for that, we need help.